What if the world you see is only the surface of a story no one dares to tell? What if, behind the image of strength, power, and unshakable dominance, there lies a fear, deep, silent, and unspoken? This isn't about politics. It's not about sides. But it's about something more powerful than propaganda, more revealing than statistics. It's about truth, the kind that keeps leaders up at night and is never mentioned in press conferences. Today, we're taking you behind the curtain, into the rooms where strategies are drawn in silence, into the hearts of those who fear the one thing they cannot control: resistance, resilience, and reality. This is the fear no one in Israel will speak aloud, but its shadow is everywhere. It shapes policies, fuels narratives, and haunts the future. From demographic time bombs to global awakening, from inner division to the indestructible spirit of a people who refuse to be erased, this story will challenge what you thought you knew. Stay with us. Don't blink, because once this truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. And once heard, it will echo far beyond the final word. The phrase demographic time bomb refers to one of the most deep-rooted and long-term fears inside Israel that rarely makes it to public discourse but influences policy at the highest levels. At the heart of this concern lies the demographic trajectory between the Jewish and Palestinian populations in Israel and the occupied territories. According to multiple studies and statistical projections, Palestinians have higher birth rates compared to Jewish Israelis, particularly in the West Bank and Gaza. This poses a future scenario where Jews may no longer maintain a majority between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea if current trends continue. This fear is not simply numerical. It strikes at the ideological foundation of a state that defines itself as both Jewish and democratic. If Palestinians were to one day become the majority, Israel would be confronted with a paradox. Either extend equal rights to all and risk losing the Jewish character of the state, or maintain a system of unequal rights and lose its democratic identity. This tension has been acknowledged behind closed doors by Israeli leaders for decades, but is seldom addressed in the open because of its explosive implications. To manage this demographic anxiety, successive Israeli governments have implemented strategies that reflect this fear, ranging from expanding settlements in the West Bank to policies that aim to incentivize Jewish immigration while limiting the residency and movement of Palestinians. The construction of the separation barrier, the controversial nation-state law passed in 2018, and ongoing efforts to Judaize certain areas, especially in East Jerusalem, all reflect deeper demographic calculations. Even peace negotiations have been influenced by this silent alarm. The two-state solution, long held as the international consensus, is in part driven by a desire to separate the populations to preserve the Jewish majority within Israel proper. Yet as the possibility of two states becomes increasingly remote, and as annexation becomes part of mainstream political discussion, this fear resurfaces with greater intensity. What makes this fear so secret is not its invisibility, but its denial. It is the conversation avoided at dinner tables, the memo read in back rooms, the strategic decision hidden beneath nationalistic slogans. It represents an existential uncertainty that military might cannot neutralize and that diplomacy alone cannot resolve. The fear of global opinion turning against Israel has become an increasingly potent concern, one that is rarely stated openly but felt deeply within the corridors of power. For decades, Israel has relied on a powerful narrative rooted in survival, persecution, and the right to defend itself. That narrative, once broadly accepted in the West, especially in the United States and Europe, is now facing unprecedented scrutiny. The rise of social media, independent journalism, and global grassroots activism has disrupted traditional channels of information control. Images from Gaza, videos from checkpoints, and personal testimonies from occupied territories circulate in real time, often bypassing mainstream media filters. These raw, emotional glimpses into Palestinian life under occupation have slowly reshaped the perceptions of millions around the world, particularly among younger generations. This shift in public opinion has translated into political consequences. On university campuses across North America and Europe, The Palestinian cause is no longer a fringe issue. It has become a moral touchstone for human rights advocacy. Movements like BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions are gaining traction not just among activists, but within institutions that once unconditionally supported Israel. In parliaments and political parties, especially among progressives, questions are being raised about military aid, arms deals, and diplomatic cover for Israeli policies. For Israeli leadership, this erosion of global support represents a critical threat. Israel has always depended not just on its military edge, but on its ability to maintain legitimacy in the eyes of the world, particularly in Western democracies. As that legitimacy begins to fray, so does Israel's strategic standing. The fear isn't just about being criticized. It's about losing the moral high ground that once insulated it from sanctions, international resolutions, and economic pressure. This is why Israel invests heavily in public diplomacy, online campaigns, and political lobbying abroad. It understands the battlefield has shifted from borders to narratives, and unlike rockets or tanks, shifting global consciousness cannot be intercepted or bombed. The idea that younger generations, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, might no longer see Israel as a beacon of democracy, but as a power enforcing an unjust system, is profoundly unsettling to the Israeli establishment. This growing moral reevaluation is not loud or explosive, but it is steady, and it threatens the very foundations of Israel's global partnerships. Internal division within Israeli society is one of the most pressing and unspoken fears that lies beneath the surface of its national discourse. While the external threats from neighboring states and Palestinian resistance dominate headlines, the growing fractures within the country itself represent a destabilizing force from within. Israel is not a monolithic society. It is a patchwork of diverse communities with distinct and often conflicting worldviews. Tensions between secular and ultra-Orthodox Jews, Ashkenazi and Mizrahi communities, left-wing liberals, and far-right nationalists have intensified in recent years, creating an atmosphere of political and social fragmentation. The divide between secular and religious Jews is particularly stark. Secular Israelis often advocate for liberal democratic values and civil rights, while ultra-Orthodox groups push for greater religious influence in state affairs, from education to military exemptions. This tension has erupted in protests, policy debates, and growing resentment, especially over the allocation of state resources and the role of religion in governance. As the ultra-Orthodox population continues to grow rapidly, so does their political clout, leading to fears among secular Israelis about the future identity of the state. Another major fault line is the cultural and economic disparity between Ashkenazi Jews of European descent and Mizrahi Jews from Middle Eastern and North African backgrounds. While both groups are Jewish, historical inequalities and feelings of marginalization have persisted, creating undercurrents of class and ethnic division. These resentments have often been exploited by populist politicians to build support, further deepening social rifts. Politically, the gap between left and right in Israel has widened to unprecedented levels. The peace camp that once advocated for coexistence and diplomacy has shrunk dramatically, while far-right nationalism and religious Zionism have become mainstream. This shift has not only polarized political debate, but also eroded trust in institutions, media, and even the judiciary. The recent judicial reform protests, which saw hundreds of thousands of Israelis in the streets, exposed the deep anxieties about the erosion of democracy from within. These internal conflicts do not just threaten societal cohesion, they raise questions about the very fabric of Israeli identity. With no common vision for the future, and with groups pulling in opposite directions, the fear is not just division, it is disintegration. It is a silent struggle over who gets to define the soul of the nation and what that nation will become. The fear of international isolation is one that haunts Israel's leadership in ways that are rarely acknowledged publicly. For much of its history, Israel has enjoyed strong diplomatic support, particularly from the United States and several European countries. This backing has translated into military aid, political cover in international institutions like the United Nations, and favorable trade relationships. However, there is a growing concern among Israeli strategists that this once solid wall of support is beginning to crack. As global awareness increases and criticism of Israeli policies becomes more mainstream, especially concerning its treatment of Palestinians, the fear of being diplomatically cornered is becoming more tangible. In recent years, there has been a noticeable shift in rhetoric from some of Israel's traditional allies. Several human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, have labeled Israel's governance over Palestinians as apartheid. These designations, once unthinkable in diplomatic circles, are now being discussed more openly in Western parliaments, academic institutions, and civil society groups. This growing willingness to confront Israel on human rights grounds represents a major break from past norms and signals a loss of the moral shield that Israel has long relied upon. The fear of isolation also stems from changing political landscapes in the West. Younger generations in the US and Europe are more critical of Israeli policies and more sympathetic to the Palestinian cause than previous generations. As these younger voices begin to shape policy and public discourse, Israeli officials worry that the era of unconditional support may be ending. This concern is heightened by the rise of left-leaning political movements and leaders in various countries who prioritize human rights and accountability over historical alliances. Economically, there is anxiety over potential sanctions, boycotts, and divestments that could follow increased diplomatic pressure. The BDS movement, while controversial, has managed to bring attention to Israel's international standing and raised alarm within Israeli economic and political circles. The threat is not just symbolic, it carries the weight of economic consequences that could affect technology sectors, cultural exchanges, and international investment. This fear of isolation is compounded by the reality that Israel exists in a region where it has few genuine allies. Surrounded by countries with complex or adversarial relations, the loss of global legitimacy would leave it increasingly alone. The fear is not only of losing political alliances, but of being delegitimized in the global community. Existential insecurity has been a defining feature of Israel's national psyche since its founding in 1948, and while the state has evolved into a regional military powerhouse with advanced defense systems, the fear of its very existence being challenged has never fully disappeared. This fear is not simply about physical security or military confrontation, but about legitimacy. The question of whether Israel truly belongs in the region and whether its right to exist is accepted by its neighbors and the wider world. Despite peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan, normalization deals through the Abraham Accords, and covert ties with other Arab states, Israel continues to operate under a deep sense of being surrounded by hostility, isolation, and moral questioning. For many Israelis, especially those with roots in Holocaust memory and centuries of Jewish persecution, the notion of an ever-present threat to their existence is both historical and emotional. This collective trauma often translates into a heightened sensitivity toward international criticism and a tendency to interpret opposition to Israeli policy as opposition to Israel's existence. The state security doctrine, political culture, and even educational narratives are shaped by this underlying insecurity, fostering a national mindset that views vulnerability not as a momentary condition, but as a permanent risk. This existential fear is also fueled by regional rhetoric that, even today, in some circles, denies Israel's legitimacy as a state. Statements from non-state actors like Hezbollah and Hamas, or from governments like Iran, reinforce this fear by calling for Israel's destruction or questioning its presence on what they consider Arab land. Even though such rhetoric is often symbolic and politically motivated, it resonates deeply within Israel and justifies a state of constant vigilance. Moreover, the unresolved conflict with the Palestinians continues to feed this fear. The refusal of many Palestinians to recognize Israel without conditions, coupled with resistance movements and international campaigns questioning Zionism, make it difficult for Israel to feel fully secure. Fully secure. Every act of resistance, every protest, and every rejection of normalization is perceived not merely as political dissent, but as an existential challenge. The fear is that without complete recognition and lasting peace, Israel's long-term survival remains uncertain, not just in terms of borders or treaties, but in the acceptance of its place in the world. This insecurity persists even as Israel builds walls, strengthens alliances, and secures its military edge, because it is rooted not in capability, but in identity. The resilience of the Palestinian people represents a profound and largely unspoken fear within Israeli strategic and political thinking. Despite decades of military occupation, displacement, economic blockade, and political suppression, the Palestinian identity has not only survived, it has strengthened. This persistence in the face of overwhelming force defies expectations and frustrates efforts to contain or erase a national movement. What makes this fear so unsettling for Israel is that it challenges the effectiveness of its most powerful tools: military dominance, political pressure, and international diplomacy. Resistance in Palestine is not confined to armed conflict. It exists in everyday acts of endurance, cultural preservation, and unrelenting calls for justice. Palestinians continue to raise their flag, teach their history, and pass down their struggle through generations. Joking, Fred. Refugees in camps for decades still speak of return as if it is a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Young Palestinians growing up under occupation develop a political consciousness early in life and carry it forward with determination. This long-term resilience is a reminder that time has not worn down the core of the Palestinian cause, despite efforts to marginalize it. Israel has invested in walls, surveillance, and legal frameworks to manage or suppress this spirit, but it persists through poetry, art, music, protests, and daily defiance against dehumanizing conditions. Internationally, the Palestinian narrative has also found renewed momentum. Activists, academics, artists, and even lawmakers around the world are increasingly recognizing Palestinian resistance not as terrorism, but as a struggle for dignity and rights. This reframing further unsettles Israel's narrative, which has long cast itself as the sole victim and legitimate power in the conflict. When the global lens begins to shift toward the resilience and suffering of Palestinians, it threatens to unravel long-standing justifications for occupation and separation. This fear is not one easily spoken of because it touches on a deeper realization that control over land does not guarantee control over people's spirits. That even in checkpoints, exile, or bombed-out homes, the idea of Palestine lives on. It is not just a geopolitical challenge, but an emotional and psychological one. The unyielding will of Palestinians represents a resistance that cannot be crushed by force alone. It is a presence that lingers, a voice that echoes, and a truth that refuses to be silenced, despite the immense efforts to erase it. Behind walls, weapons, and unwavering rhetoric lies a silence Israel rarely allows itself to confront, the fear not of destruction, but of truth. A truth that demographic realities cannot be ignored forever. That the world's gaze is shifting, and the moral ground is no longer firm. That internal fractures threaten unity more than any outside force. That global isolation is no longer hypothetical but inching closer. That legitimacy, no matter how long established, can be questioned when justice is denied. And perhaps most of all, that the spirit of the Palestinian people, though battered, cannot be broken. These fears are not shouted in headlines. They live in quiet strategy rooms, whispered in closed-door meetings, buried beneath speeches of strength and declarations of control. But truth has a way of surfacing. And now, for the first time in a long time, the world is beginning to listen. To face fear is not weakness. It is the first step to healing, but only if there is the courage to speak it aloud. Thank you for staying with us till the end. In a world full of noise, your willingness to listen deeply, reflect critically, and seek understanding truly matters. May you carry this awareness with strength, and may truth always guide your voice. Good luck on your journey toward justice, compassion, and clarity.